Hi, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Janine, and I'm from the Design Singapore Council. I'll be your MC and moderator today. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, To Our City with Love, which is the third in this series. These webinars are held as part of the Lovable Singapore Project, led by the Design Singapore Council and our partners, the Centre for Livable Cities, Deloitte Centre for the Edge, the Housing and Development Board, National University of Singapore's School of Design and Environment, Participate in Design, and the Urban Redevelopment Authority in support of the Singapore Together movement. This event is also part of the National Design Centre's program lineup for April and May with a thematic focus on casting hope. So this evening's program is in two parts. The first will be a sharing by the project team. So Larry from Participate in Design will be talking about the design approach and methodology behind the study. And afterwards, we will be sharing some initial findings from the study. Part two of the webinar will be a panel discussion on designing for a post-pandemic lovable Singapore, as well as designing a sense of agency and ownership. All throughout, you are welcome to drop your questions in the Q&A box. If there are unanswered questions, we will address them in the last open Q&A segment. So first, to start us off, I would like to invite Mr. Mark Wee, Executive Director of the Design Singapore Council, to give us some opening remarks. Mark leads the Council in driving and implementing national policies on design as DSG continues on its Design 2025 journey, which is to make Singapore an innovation-driven economy and a livable city by design. An award-winning design veteran with wide industry connections, Mark has brought the work of the Council to the attention of global design leaders via platforms such as Brainstorm Design, Milan Design Week, and the International Architecture Exhibition. Please welcome Mark.
Hey, Janine. Anyway, I thanks for everyone dialing in. Good evening, everyone. Warm welcome to our webinar, To Our City of Love. This is really the third of our three-part series exploring what a lovable Singapore means to us. And I'm Mark, and I'm very happy to welcome such a wonderful and diverse audience from Singapore and beyond. I understand that today we actually have guests from East and Southeast Asia, Australia, and various parts of Europe as well. So thank you to everyone for just joining us this evening. I know a number of you all might be joining us for the first time, so I'll just take a few minutes to introduce Design Singapore Council and what we do. As a national agency for design, our vision actually is for Singapore to be an innovation-driven economy and a lovable city through design. Two quite distinctive but very meaningful kind of objectives. We help organizations and enterprises use design as a strategy to grow your business and deliver people-centered public services, nurture industry-ready talent, and enable a design-minded workforce for the future economy. But we also promote the Singapore brand through raising design appreciation on home ground and making emotional connections with people across the world, for example, through this webinar. I'm personally excited to introduce the topic of our webinar today, which is about how we can come together to design a lovable Singapore. And this is an important milestone for us, as it is our first public sharing of the insights from a long research study in the area of lovability in Singapore, involving more than 2,300 respondents, generating over 9,000 minutes of engagement and insights, and hotly discussed with multiple partners. At this point, I think earlier Janine gave a shout out to our project partners, the URA, HDB, CLC, Centre for Livable City. Sorry, I know there's a lot of acronyms. SG Together, the National University of Singapore, Deloitte Centre for the Edge, and Participate in Design. And you'll be hearing from some of them later at the panel discussion. Through our study in the Lovable Singapore Project, we have heard many stories, some early insights, some surprising, some inspiring, and a few funny and heartwarming ones. We heard about how the fast-paced transformation of Singapore's landscape has affected its people's sense of connection with the history and places of Singapore, how urbanization leads to the new breathing spaces, and how certain space typologies actually offer users a sense of freedom by being inclusive and authentic. We also heard from the 2,300 respondents we surveyed what they found lovable or unlovable about our local identity, relationship with institutions, and fellow Singaporean residents. Apparently, being law-abiding scored pretty high on our list, to our surprise. And we are looking forward to sharing this and more insights and stories with you in this webinar. 2 questions we hope to explore in today's webinar will help to shape what the future lovable city could look like. 1, and how can we design lovability for a post-COVID world? And related to that, how can we use design and design tools to actually foster a sense of ownership and agency amongst people? The answers to these questions are important not just to Singapore, but also, we believe, to the rest of the world. And today, more than half of the world's population lives in urban areas. And as you know, by 2050, 2/3 of the global population will actually do so, according to the United Nations. Along with that, cities are facing increasingly complex problems like climate change, the aging population, economic recession as a result of geopolitical uncertainties, and not to mention, of course, the severe consequence that a global pandemic has had on our urban society and economy. So we feel strongly that the solutions to these challenges will be driven by people who love the places they live in and who have a stake in actually improving the lives of their communities and environment. And in the coming months, we'll be working with partner agencies to run focus groups and programs to actually find actionable solutions through our insights. And you're very welcome to sign up. So please keep a lookout for details at the end of the session. We are also very excited to gather our panelists from diverse backgrounds across public, private, and academic sectors. And they spend much of their careers thinking and working on creating lovability. And finally, I'm sure our speakers tonight will agree with me. We are keen to hear from you, our audience, through the polls and Q&A. We hope that this session will be interactive, candid, and open. So I warmly invite you to participate with your views tonight. And with this, I would like to hand over the time to our research team and panelists, and I wish everyone, of course, a very lovable evening. So thank you.
So now let's kick off the sharing with Larry from Participate in Design. So how does one design a study on lovability? What is the approach that was taken? What kind of challenges and learning points were there? We have been working with Participate in Design on this project for more than a year. So Larry, Executive Director, has a lot of learning points to share on what the participatory approach and methodologies taken to shape a study on lovability could be. Larry, over to you.
Thanks, Janine, and hi, very good evening to everybody. My name is Larry. I'm the Executive Director for Participate in Design. And of course, I'm really, really excited to share, the whole journey of talking about lovability of Singapore. Yeah, so I think for us, we really started off the research with 2 main questions, right? What do people love about Singapore? And what will make people love Singapore more? Now, if I were to just throw this name about lovability to all of you, it's quite challenging, right? When we first started off talking to our, 60-year-old grandma or 40-year-old auntie, what does lovability mean? They do not know how to respond. I think as Asians, we don't really talk about love. Livability, yes. Quality of life satisfaction, yes. But what exactly is lovability? What is love for a city? Yeah, so I think for us, we really want to know what exactly is lovability in Singapore. What do our daily Singaporeans and everyday people define love, right? And what are some of the interventions that we can actually go about doing to make this place more lovable? And what are some framework and methodology that we use for this study? So I think, like I said, we do not want the study to just be limited to a group of experts or academics. We really want to hear from everyday people from all walks of life. What exactly does lovability mean to you? And I think even though it was the pandemic, I'm really very pleased. We managed to engage around 2,400 residents with almost over 50,000 engagement minutes for this entire study, which I will share a little bit more what we did. So I think it's always very challenging to have a study like that, because how do we balance the viewpoints of academics with our partner agencies, with our everyday people? Because everybody has so many different definitions of love. right? So I think what we did in the first phase, in the connect and framing phase, was really to look at all the studies around the world. We really want to understand, right, what it means to be, to actually talk about, when we talk about lovability in business and in the lens of creative industry. So I think DSG done some focus group discussion to get these people to talk about what are their definition of love. And this gave us a little bit of basic understanding of what lovability means in the so-called, creative sector and business sector. And we have asked more questions as well through our literature review, right? What is our favorite place on earth? On a rating of 1 to 10, how lovable is Singapore? There are a lot of similar studies done overseas. So we actually took reference from them to set a context of what we feel love is all about. And with this initial study and this initial understanding, we actually went to test out, with a group of, selected individuals, which range across, domestic helpers, persons with disabilities, and seniors. We tested out this with them. And then we also went into this, what we call a deep dive interviews with what we call the extreme users, right? People who are not your mainstream community, but yet they may have a viewpoint about love. We went to talk to them to try to understand them. And these also include your foreign workers, single mothers or LGBTQ community. We also talk to experts because we do realize the importance of academics and the experts in this field to get their viewpoint as well. And with this whole holistic view on love, we will then be able to frame more questions and more curated viewpoints to reach out to the bigger community, which is in our next stage. So in our qualitative stage, we designed various engagement channels, right? That actually includes talking about To Me Singapore Is, whereby we get residents to just share with us very quickly what they feel Singapore is like to them. We also do this online Kopi Talk, whereby, because we can't do physical engagement due to the pandemic, we actually went to engage with different people from different walks of life. And surprisingly, we have a lot of tech-savvy seniors as well who join us, who also managed to share with us perspective of other seniors who are not tech-savvy. So that was actually quite interesting. We also have this thing called the online show and tell to run a very in-depth qualitative survey with different people from different walks of life as well. And right now, we are very pleased to be at this stage whereby we actually did some milieu findings, whereby we went out on a quantitative survey with 2,000 over Singaporeans to verify and validate some of the findings that we found out. And I think later on, Janine, of course, will share with you a lot of interesting findings that we found out. And I think you guys can't wait to actually hear from Janine. But before I pass it over to Janine, I would just like to again echo what Mark has said earlier as well. We will be having a lot of co-creation sessions to have actionable solutions to really co-create these solutions with you. So if you can scan the QR code over there, I think you can take a look at the different dates of the different workshops. So do sign up with us, all right? And without further ado, I'll pass the time over back to Janine, who will share with you all our very interesting findings and heartwarming stories that we hear from the ground. So Janine, over to you.
Thanks, Larry. Okay, great. So now on to the findings of the surveys that we ran from October to March. I'm actually here to share the highlights of the survey. The full report will be out in June. But for now, we want to show you a snapshot of how people have responded to our surveys and also get your inputs to the findings. So as Larry has mentioned, the topic of lovability is quite broad and somewhat nebulous. So we had to use an initial framing phase of the study to scope the study into manageable themes. And this has helped us to identify 4 main themes through which we ran the subsequent surveys. So we looked at spaces, identity and culture, people and behavior, and relationship with public institutions. We were then able to ask our survey respondents more targeted questions around these themes. Okay, so first, what did people tell us about lovable spaces? In our quantitative survey done with 2,000 people, as Larry mentioned, 45% said that lovable spaces must most importantly allow them to spend time with their loved ones. This resonated more with the younger respondents, especially the 16 to 25 age group, but also the above 55 age group. 40% told us that they must be able to take a breather, and the answer was spread quite equally across all age groups. So in the interest of time, we have highlighted the top 5 lovability factors out of many. I'm just going to talk about the first 2 so that we have enough time to delve into the panel discussion afterwards. But if you have questions on the other factors, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A. So doing a qualitative interview actually helped us to uncover more nuance and details on why people answered the way they did previously. So through our qualitative interviews, we also saw that the importance of social connection, not just with one's social circle, but also the opportunity to encounter other people is very important. And also during the circuit breaker, I think breathing spaces became all the more important, especially as a physical and psychological escape in Singapore's high density living. So we've got some quotes here from participants in our qualitative interviews. Here there's a lady talking about the Ulu Pandan Park Connector, which makes her feel like everything is back to normal. It's a place that she goes to get away from daily life. In terms of unlovable spaces, I think the reasons are quite self-explanatory. Most of them focus around disamenities and poor maintenance. Inconsiderate behavior was felt most strongly amongst respondents in their 40s and above. However, our qualitative interviews brought out more interesting nuances. So besides disamenities from the lack of considerate usage, during the interviews, people also told us that disamenities are poor facilities for those with different needs. So you can see here an example about someone who felt concerned for her friend who needed wheelchair access but was unable to get one. We also heard from people about not liking places that lack character and charm. And quite interestingly, there were quite a lot of mentions about malls in Orchard Road. Okay, so when asked about lovable aspects of Singapore identity and culture, the clear front runner was about the food culture, also about Singapore's multicultural and acceptance of cultural diversity. Although I should point out that when we broke down the data, we could see that the under 35-year-old respondents actually tended to disagree with this second point more, whereas the older respondents agreed more than the average. Actually, being accepting of cultural diversity was brought up during our qualitative surveys as a point of pride, frequently with interviewees telling us that seeing different cultures being celebrated actually made Singapore feel more lovable to them. And also food, Singlish, the heartland way of life, we could see that they function as a clear, uniquely Singapore cultural marker, and therefore as a social glue for many. In terms of unlovable aspects, the quantitative survey was also very clear. I would say that out of the top 5, we can see that the first 4 actually centers around livability issues and perhaps unhappiness around income inequalities. This was especially prominent amongst the 25 to 45 age group. Even the 5th factor, around unlovable Singaporean characteristics, also tends to be centered around things like competitiveness, being kiasu or afraid to lose. So let's see what respondents told us about lovable people and lovable behavior in Singapore. As Mark mentioned, interestingly, being law-abiding came up tops by far. So this was a factor voted amongst an entire long list of factors given to respondents that is most important for in terms of lovable behavior in Singapore. The next three I would say are around building strong social bonds and community networks. So having positive relationships is clearly very important to us, as well as having empathy and civic mindedness. I think we have to further unpack why being law-abiding is so important to lovability. Could possibly have something to do with being mindful of the social contract and being considerate to other people, which are points that we saw mentioned earlier, especially in terms of use of space. Okay, so here we have the results from the qualitative survey, which talked about acts of kindness and care in micro communities, especially in the neighborhood, as well as showing spontaneity and openness in interacting with people that we encounter in public. So again, this relates to the point about showing friendliness and openness, not just to your own social circle, but also beyond. And that's an important factor in lovability to our respondents. So on the flip side, unlovable behavior, the topmost factor was about being judgmental and close-minded, and then afterwards being inconsiderate, both within one's neighborhood as well as in public spaces, being competitive and being unfriendly. So I think we can see some repetitive themes coming up. Yeah, this is from our qualitative interviews, which again which again bring up the same points about considerate behavior. And I think this point comes up quite a lot because of the realities of high density urban living, in which one person's behavior actually has a big impact on other people. Okay, the last theme that we asked our respondents about centers around their relationships with public institutions. So we defined public institutions not just in terms of government agencies, but also with schools. So what respondents told us is most lovable about public institutions is this sense of security, being well taken care of, and a sense of trustworthiness. So you can see here that the qualitative interviews actually echoed what respondents in the quantitative surveys have said, which is that public institutions do make respondents feel that they are taken care of and provided with a certain good standard of living. In terms of unlovable aspects of relationships with public institutions, I think this might not be quite surprising to many people. There are some common themes here around feeling a sense of a lack of safe space for disagreement, or a lack of opportunity to give feedback that is heard, the feeling of over-curation, over-regulation, and all of this leading to a sense of disempowerment. We saw this unpacked quite a lot when we did our qualitative interviews. Our respondents actually helped us to understand lack of empowerment in different ways. So one could be people feeling that, oh yeah, I can't change anything. I'm just one person. Some others told us that they feel that they have no part to play in change because they don't feel a sense of ownership, or they may want to advocate for change but have a feeling of fear or trepidation. And then others also feel like, okay, they may want to have change, but they don't know how to start and they don't know what viable alternatives might be. So staying on this point a little bit, this is something that we are really hoping to unpack during the panel discussion, especially the topic on how we can design for a sense of ownership and agency. Okay, in conclusion, so is Singapore lovable or not? So I think we could say that 69% of our respondents feel that Singapore is mostly lovable and completely lovable. 5% feel that Singapore is definitely not lovable, I think what's interesting to us is that quite a significant percentage of the respondents, over a quarter, actually are undecided that Singapore is neither lovable nor unlovable. We will go on to the panel discussion, and I would like to introduce our panelists. Okay, so first we have Mr. Dulisha Kulasuriya, Executive Director of Deloitte Center for the Edge. Dulisha is also our knowledge partner for the Lovable Singapore Project. So could I invite panelists, when I read out your names, to also please turn on your cameras so that the audience can see you. Next, we've got Dawn, Coordinating Director, Partnership Projects Office at MCCY. So she also spearheads the Singapore Together movement, and Singapore Together is also one of our partners for the project. Next, we have Professor Heng Chai Kiang, Provost Chair, Director of Center for Sustainable Asian Cities at NUS, who is also our project partner. Next up is Mr. Tong Yi, Executive Director of Common Ground, who is our Design Singapore Council board member. And last but not least, Dr. Adrian Phua, Director, Futures Office of the President at NUS. So we invited Dr. Phua because of his pioneering work in the intersection of futures, public policy, and education. So I'd like to kickstart the discussion with Dawn, who has been running the Emerging Stronger Conversations for the past few months. Dawn, would you like to talk about some commonalities that you've seen in the Lovable Singapore study and the Emerging Stronger Conversations?
Yeah, I'd be glad to, Janine. And thank you and welcome everyone to this really interesting webinar. And I love the work that the Design Singapore Council is doing on the Lovable Singapore idea. So as I read your slides and heard you give this presentation, and picking up some of the key ideas around what people felt made Singapore lovable and what made Singapore unlovable, what really struck me is some of these were so common to what we also heard from Singaporeans through the Emerging Stronger conversations. So these conversations happened, we kicked it off last year in the heart of COVID-19 to engage Singaporeans in a conversation about their COVID experience, and also to hear their hopes and their ideas about how Singapore can emerge stronger. And what they told us has just been put out in a report in February, and you can go to www.sg/Emerging Stronger Conversations to have a look at it. But some of the things that were similar to what the Lovable Singapore Project has uncovered include things like, on the unlovable side, Singapore is very stressful. And what COVID taught us is actually we can slow down the pace, and people enjoyed that space to breathe. They discovered parts of Singapore they didn't know were there before. People enjoyed the time to connect with their families. This idea about Singaporeans being very judgmental and quick to give their opinion and not necessarily thinking too hard before they offered an opinion also came up. And there was an invitation, I think, for Singaporeans to think about how we can be a bit more accommodating of each other's views. And then on the lovable side, I hear the words around Singaporeans being gracious, considerate, caring, inclusive, and generous. And that really was what Singaporeans told us they saw during COVID. All of us would have seen examples of Singaporeans from all walks of life just stepping forward to do something to help their community, their neighbor, people in need. And that was what Singaporeans saw that they really appreciated and wanted to see more of going forward. So that was what really struck me. There was a fair bit of overlap between what we had heard in the Emerging Strong Conversations and in your project as well.
Thanks, Dawn. Next, I would like to call on Adrian to talk about the nuances between a city and a nation in terms of looking at lovability. Adrian also has previously brought up an interesting question about, it's not just, when we think about lovability, it's not just about whether we love the city, but whether the city loves us back. And I think a lot of what he looks at riffs off what Dawn just said earlier. So handing the time over to you, Adrian.
Great, thanks very much. Hi everyone, thanks for having me here. So first of all, let me just say that it's so important to have this conversation right now because so much of our Singapore narrative is framed in terms of fear, insecurity, scarcity, even paranoia. And forget that throughout, there's always been hope and solidarity and love. So I think this conversation is very important to have right now. But here we are talking about love and lovability and lovingness and all these things. And this in this age of messiness and contestation. And we should also at the same time be not so naive to expect that all our discussions and all our conversations will culminate in some finality, some kumbaya moment. So in the interest of in acknowledging the messiness, what I'd like to do now is to introduce some messiness and contest some of the terms that we've been using throughout. So in as much as we wring our hands about whether Singapore is lovable or unlovable, and we also at the same time need to ask whether that which is the object of our desire, if it loves us back. And I think there are also many layers to peel back. So, you could be lovable and loved, and that's awesome, and that's, magical. And at the same time, you could be unlovable and unloved, and that's poetic justice, so you kind of deserve it. But I think the other two possibilities are rather interesting to consider. You could be lovable and yet be strangely unloved. And at the same time, you are actually rather unlovable, but strangely enough, you're quite loved. And how on earth did that happen? So when you talk about unlovable or lovability and all manner of permutations of that term, you also kind of need to ask, what manner of love are we talking about, right? So I noticed that the title of this project is To Our City with Love. And you're talking about Singapore as the city, but we are both a city and a nation state, and perhaps love in these two different contexts means different things. So when we talk about love, are we talking about love as a raging passion, right? And that perhaps speaks to Singapore as a city with all the messiness and the dynamism and the flows and the chaos and the fringe and the underside and the and all the things that gives the city the buzz? Or are we talking about love as a warm, fuzzy, steady, burning furnace that perhaps speaks to Singapore as a nation state, right? So in a sense, I'm asking, is Singapore the kind of place that seduces you and makes you want to be seduced? Or is Singapore that comfortable place of solace and predictability, kind of like the book that you read over and over again? Yeah, you know the plot, but you love the book and you're happy to read it over and over again. Or are we talking about the tough love, right? The kind of city that tells you the reality as it is and pulls no punches. So I think these are some of the things that we really do need to consider, and we all love the place for different reasons. Some of us love it for its prosaic perfections, and it's precisely that makes other people hate it. And others of us love the place for its perfect imperfections, like the song goes, and yet it's also the things that make other people hate it. So I thought I would just surface some of these thoughts for the audience to think through, and I'd love to hear my panelists, fellow panelists, to hear what they think about it. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Adrian. So from different types of love, I think that kind of reminds me of something that Yi had spoken to us about in terms of emotions and emotional scarcity that occurs as a result of experiencing a pandemic, and how that actually affects the type of love that we have for the place that we live in. So Yi, I would like to invite you to tell us more about that.
Sure. Thanks, Janine. Yeah, this is a quick shout out. I just noticed that old friend Basil Chen is in the attendance. Hi, Chen. Yeah, I was really actually echoing about. I was resonating with the results that the findings were sharing, right, as well as basically what Adrian and Don were sharing. I take to the optimism of actually what Don was sharing about basically what many people found valuable about Singapore post this pandemic. But I'm also myself, right, understanding that the pandemic revealed, I guess, multiple different inequalities in Singapore. And in that particular sense of inequality, we took some time to just understand families in terms of who felt that they were part of families in which they felt they loved. They loved their families, they felt safe in their families, and what were the characteristics, right? They began to just help them feel that families itself, right, were a good place to be in. And we tried to look at families and just extrapolate that understanding around love, of having being part of a loving family and a lovable family, and take that and extend it into societies in general. And what we saw, and it came down to, was this whole principle between families that were breeding scarcity or families that were holding abundance. And the gist of it over here, right, came down to three main themes that we were seeing. The first one was the people who truly begin to feel that they love their families were ideas that they felt they could belong in their families, they felt safe, they feel loved, despite the strong diversity of views within the family itself. And I thought that was fascinating in seeing similar themes itself within Singapore society itself, whether or not people find a sense of belonging or whether they're simply trying to fit in. And I guess basically when it comes down to push comes to shove, right, and resources are not enough, and sometimes we are strapped for resources, we always ask ourselves, who gets the pie and who doesn't get the pie? Do I have to necessarily fit in to be able to get the pie, or do I get the pie, even though I'm different? And I get to feel itself, right, that I truly belong. Okay, so that's one particular theme. The second over here was around families when they felt that each member of the family were all healthy and also contributing fairly. So they were talking about, fathers, mothers, or the lazy sister that wouldn't contribute, or some story like that over here, right? And I found that, again, the theme was very strong itself in Singapore society itself, whether or not we felt that, we are part of a society where everybody really contributes fairly, whether or not everybody itself is really healthy to begin to contribute. And doing so over here, I think one of the big themes around Singapore, the whole stressful Singapore part, right, is that a lot of the stress forces priority on us. When we have limitation of time, when we feel strapped, and whether or not we can choose to love despite all that need for priority. The third theme that we were seeing over here, and the last theme, was an idea that the families themselves actually gave opportunity. They gave an empowerment. And this is actually echoing a lot itself with actually what you guys have found within your own surveys, whether people felt disempowered, whether they felt itself like they really had a sense of ownership in all this diversity that we're seeing. So those were the three themes, right, that come up. And it came down to primarily itself, unfortunately, we will have to say, to mindsets, to attitudes, to whether or not people were in their own language, bringing about more abundance within the family systems, or just feeding scarcity there. And it was very much a linguistic experience for many of them. But those are the things itself that I was echoing with, and what our own field of work is revealing to us. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Lee. Actually, we've been talking a lot about emotional impact with regards to the question of lovability. And I'd like to kind of take the conversation into something a little bit more tangible, talking about placemaking, which is something that I think Prof. Heng can tell us more about. So what's the role of placemaking in engendering or enhancing lovability, especially being a project partner? How do you feel about seeing the results that were shared just now? So Prof. Heng, over to you.
Well, perhaps I should follow up on what was just some of the themes mentioned earlier, especially with regards to COVID-19 and all the efforts, the work that selflessness of our neighbors, our citizens, contributing in different manners. Well, that's very heartwarming. And in fact, one of the, I think a few things about environment that sort of probably make that possible or make that more easy is that, number one, we, for some reason, have provided, right, incidentally, maybe in the way we plan our environment, especially the density, right? It makes helping families in need rather easier. You go to a new town, you can help out a lot of families, as opposed to the kind of very low density environments where you have to drive, you have to whatever. So here, and so I think our environment makes it easier to help out many families all at once. The other thing is that you need space. You need space for things to happen, right? You need space to. So I see on TV people packing all these boxes, all these packages, all these bags. You need space, and they can do it in the public space, in the void decks, all sorts of places. And again, this is something that, well, through our planning, through our the way we plan our new towns, etc., we created all these spaces, which now comes to good use. And perhaps when it comes to placemaking, again, in this, what COVID-19 has really shown us is that public space, community space, and open spaces, parks, town centers, etc., becomes very much sought after. People, if there's a choice, you rather dine al fresco or in the open air rather than within a restaurant. So these places becomes very important. And I think in this episode of COVID-19, it shows us, and probably we'll talk more about it later on, the importance of public space, of community spaces within our new towns, within our neighborhoods. Yeah. Well, let me just stop here. I'm sure we'll have more time to talk about the importance of this and other tangible physical stuff. Thanks.
Thank you, Prof. Heng. So last we have Dulisha, who is a very special person because he has actually journeyed with us on this Lovable Singapore study almost practically from day one. And I think we hit the circuit breaker together and had to change the entire approach of the study together. So having heard all the panelists' insights about both the tangible and intangible aspects of lovability, I'd actually like to ask you something as our knowledge partner. How do you think, what kind of implications do all of these have on the post-pandemic Lovable Singapore? What would we do with all these findings? And when you joined us as a knowledge partner, what was your vision for this project?
Yeah, thank you, Janine, for having me along for this whole journey. It's been very interesting, to say the least. So just as a context for the audience, we moved here in June 2019 from the US. And so we had 6 months on the ground before COVID hit. And the initial planning and everything was around, and we were so excited about meeting people live, having kind of physical interactions, observing them in the natural habitat, and then COVID hit. So everything had to fundamentally change. So we have to recognize in some part that the results that they're getting is with the backdrop of a year in lockdown, right? So it may not be, if you were to run these surveys and studies on an ongoing basis, year over year, you might find different results. But we found a lot of things affirming. And I think what we saw with COVID is something that we can all relate to individually. It's a concentration, right? Many of us felt stressed at one point or the other through that because we were more confined. We had less options. We felt stuck. You couldn't get out. And other points, we found space for reflection. It was a crisis, right, in many ways, and that gave point for reflection. I'm sure many of you found that you spend more time with your family than you ever had, as Tong you mentioned, and there are many lovable parts to it and some unlovable parts to that too, right? This is the most time I spent with my family as long as I've had a family. So I think we're emerging to a post-pandemic time now as we emerge from this. We're not going to bounce back to everything being the same. Some things will change forever, right? Work, going to work, how we work is going to change fundamentally. It's going to be, yes, a bit of a transition, but it's not going to transition back to what it was before. There's a group I'm part of in Facebook, the Singapore hiking group. Pre-pandemic, it was 2,000 people. Now it's like 72,000 people. And I don't know whether they were hiking before and they just got on it, to exchange images and to showcase, or whether this was pushed by it. Bicycle sales have tripled over the last few months, right? So many of us, myself included, saw many parts of Singapore that we never would have for years. So there are some things that I hope are going to continue. And with that comes a heightened desire, at least for myself personally, to be in nature more. And I think that's reflected in some of the studies and all the comments from the panelists, to be in community more. And what does community mean? And I think we have to tackle the fact that some things that are lovable for some are unlovable for others. The example that Janine pointed out of, hey, people, drinking and making noise, that to me is quite lovable. That's kind of people enjoying themselves. But to my in-laws, that was quite unlovable. So uncouth, so loud, right? And I think that's reflected by many. Someone was asking whether it's an over 45 thing. I'm over 45. So I think we're not going to bounce back to the same. I think we've had deep points of reflection, and I'm really hoping that everyone on this call and many others would engage in the workshops to design a more lovable Singapore, because we need all those voices to make something that is lovable for as many people, at least at some point in time.
Thanks, Dulisha. So, originally when I was designing this so-called very lovable webinar, Dulisha's comments would have segued us very nicely and smoothly into the next topic, which was on designing the post-pandemic lovability in Singapore. Unfortunately, Mentimeter did not feel the same way, or I failed to activate it correctly. But I think now I am going to try to share screen with Mentimeter, and let's see the results of the first poll. Okay, here goes nothing. All right. Okay, I think it is showing. Okay, cool, awesome. Sigh of relief. All right, so just now we kind of asked everyone to let us know whether the so-called top factors in both lovability and unlovability resonated with you personally. So like, during the surveys, we found that top factor for lovable places is being able to spend time there with your loved ones and take a breather from everyday life. And did you agree with that? So I think that met with a lot of agreement, both in terms of the lovable places and top factors for unlovable places. So that seems to align very well with what our audience feels. In terms of Singapore identity and culture, what's lovable and unlovable? Oh, I think top factors for unlovable Singapore identity and culture, stressful pace of life, elitist and materialistic culture, I think that resonated the least with our audience right now. That would be interesting to unpack. In terms of behavior, surprisingly, many people, I think, agree that being law-abiding, friendly, and having strong community bonds is resonates with them, similar to unlovable behavior. And top factors for lovable public institutions, I think quite clear agreement. Okay, top factors for unlovable public institutions. It's a bit surprising to me that it's not like that the audience is not more strongly in agreement that these are the factors that cause unlovability. I'm wondering if any of our panelists would like to comment on what they're seeing. So, Dulisha, I'm seeing you.
We were typing because Tongi found out it was actually not 72,000 or 7,200 for hiking, but there were 32,000 for wildlife spotting. So people are still outdoors a lot. Looking at this, I don't see any big surprises. Where's the law-abiding one? Did that come up again?
So that means, I mean, I would say like more than half of our audience agreed that these are indeed lovable behavior to them. I'm kind of surprised that the part about the unlovable public institutions. I thought there would be more agreement that there is a lack of space for disagreement. There's too many laws and regulations, and there is not enough opportunities to be heard. But currently, the slider is at 3.5. Yeah. Dawn, what do you think? I mean, from your emerging stronger experience, does this line up?
Well, in a way it does, because through the Emerging Stronger conversations, there were quite a number of themes that came up. And this question of, I guess, to what extent do we engage each other, whether it's public institutions or just civic participation in general, it was a key issue, but probably not one of the top ranked issues. The ones that people cared about the most were around social support and what are our values, what do we stand for. This point about being able to spend time and take a breather definitely was one of the values kind of points that came up. So there is some alignment, I would say, yeah. And I guess what I'm reflecting on also, as having heard the various panelists speak, is that to even be able to say, I love Singapore because of this, and I find Singapore unlovable because of this. Actually, there's something very cathartic about it. And the process of being able to articulate what's unlovable can actually be part of the lovable process, if I'm making sense. This process of inviting criticism can be part of making something lovable.
Yes, that's a point that I have never considered, and I think it's very true. And I hope this is something we can unpack both today and in the subsequent workshops that we're running, to zero in on what we can do in certain areas of strong unlovability. So actually, on this note, I'm gonna get our audience to do another poll before we move into the discussion on how COVID has impacted our sense of love for Singapore, or how we have felt love from Singapore. And I am really, really hoping it works again. Okay, so I hope everyone can see a purple screen in front of you. So yeah, if you just go to menti.com and use the code there, you should come to this purple screen, which asks you on how your outlook on the following has changed as a result of your experiences during COVID. So I believe you can rank it in order of importance. So we're curious to know whether having experienced a pandemic for, well, a year now, has your view on whether Singapore is an inclusive society changed? Has your personal aspirations changed? Your willingness to contribute to Singapore society, your willingness to contribute to your community, your view on what good governance is. And oh, wow, okay, I can see the results now. And the last one is view on national identity. Okay, so I think what has changed most is certainly, things are moving. Okay, I'm just going to give it some time to settle down. Okay. Inclusivity has come up tops. Yeah, I think that's probably something that has, oh no, now it's third. Interesting. Okay. All right, let's close off the polls now so that we can have some discussion. Okay, so let's close off the polls now. I'd like to direct my first question to Yi about inclusivity. So just now you talked a little bit about the experience of different families during COVID, abundance versus scarcity. Yeah. What do you think is happening here when our audience is saying that their view on whether Singapore as an inclusive society has changed? And maybe I should also add in from our own surveys, we got quite a few responses about how people felt disappointed, especially with regards to the treatment of the foreign workers, and also their own observations of how COVID has had a far more deleterious impact on lower income segments. Yeah.
Yeah. The at least what we're noticing from our side over here is that really it's a generational thing. The whole idea of inclusion is very much maybe I think a more stronger theme itself for those who are maybe 40 and below, to put it generously. And I've met multiple different groups over here that really cannot fathom what this inclusion thing is about. They don't really get it. So there's some parents over here that just have not actually within their own social circles expressed enough diversity to understand what people are so upset about. Yeah, and I think there is that strong sense over here that, oh, you know, what's everybody getting so worked up about around this whole idea of diversity and inclusion. And so the diversity around anything from personality to ideas of introverts to gender equality and things like that, right? It's very much a generational thing. So the spiking up of the emotion, right, and the strong intensity of emotions that's attached to it, yeah, seems to be a lot in terms of new language that's coming from overseas, as well as basically a language among ourselves that what was typically under the table before now has platform by which to be heard. And there are multiple different themes over, especially coming from the minority races, coming out to just simply say that, you know, no longer will we be silent. We really wish that you would understand and hear why is it we don't feel included, even though, you know, we have Racial Harmony Day. So that is something that's coming up. Yeah, but really when we do this work itself, right, intergenerational, well, you can see there's always this like a furrowed brow coming from the older generations, like, what are you talking about? And they absolutely don't get it. Yeah, I suspect though it's a theme to stay. If it's really coming from younger generations, it's going to be in Singapore at least for a good next 20-30 years or so. Yeah, so I would pay attention to it.
I think what you said absolutely hits the nail on the head when we looked at you know, our data and break it down by age group. Inclusivity does tend to be something that, you know, a certain the younger generation thinks about more, or rather that inclusivity in terms of you know, like sexual orientation, ethnicity. The older generation we saw were more concerned about inclusivity in terms of you know, physical access to spaces. And actually on this note, there's this really interesting question from the audience which I would like to bring up, and maybe Prof Heng and Adrian might want to answer it. So I'll read out the question from Ronglun Ko. So this is for all panelists. He says, he or she, sorry, I find it lovable that we somewhat consider inclusiveness issues in designing our living space. However, as we ask ourselves, who have been missed out, could we have ironically missed out the question of, am I in the picture? Say for accessibility and mobility issues, oftentimes we frame those issues from the perspective of wheelchair users, but by doing that, we neglect children with school bags on wheels, the couples pushing infants in prams, the elderly who shop with trolley bags, and you and I as well, who enjoy traveling and using luggages which come with wheels. Could we have missed according to gravity, accessibility and mobility issues, and missed the opportunity to make our living space even more lovable? Should we have seen ourselves in the big picture of accessibility and mobility issues? And it ends off by asking, do we need to love ourselves more as we love others? Okay. All right. Prof Heng, would you like to take a stab at this? I think it's a really interesting and unusual question about designing spaces for inclusivity.
Well, thanks for this. I think, yes, thanks for this question. Indeed, I think when we design our spaces, we have to think of all sorts of people with all manners of mobility, right? So I agree entirely that we have to think of the 3-year-old toddler to the 85-year-old grandmother, and in between, and everybody in between. So yes, we have codes for universal accessibility, etc. But I think more than that, it is also for designers and planners to really understand a behavior, understand people's behavior, understand people's use of space, and plan accordingly. So yes, of course, we plan our space to be community spaces to be inclusive. What I wanted to say earlier on, maybe since we talk a lot about lovability, in my earlier remark, I should have said that, you know, we must plan our environment such that it offers opportunities of all segments of society to really realize the potential. Because I see in here also this in your survey here, personal aspirations, right? We should plan our environment to allow for that. So, for example, when we talk about the COVID-19 earlier on, if I find meaning and purpose in serving others, right, in volunteering, I must be able to find space to do that, right? Be it a void deck, be it a space that in our HDB environment, somewhere that I can do so, and space allows to do that. So if I find purpose and meaning in meeting friends for line dancing, I must be able to find place to do that, and so on and so forth. So different people find fulfillment in different things, and being able to realize that, I think, makes them love their city even more. This comes back to the part where it says stressful Singapore. Yes, it's stressful, especially for work, but different people over the 20%, the weekend or the evenings, the 20% of the time where they don't work, will find various activities to relax, to derive meaning, purpose, etc. And we should provide those spaces. Yeah. Okay, I stop there. Thanks. Over to you.
Yeah, so you know, one of the pitfalls of speaking after a professor is that you're just sitting there crossing off the things that you wanted to say because he's already said them. So I really agree with a lot of what Chai Kiang said. I would just simply add that you know, as Singapore becomes a more complex place and things become more tightly coupled, and there are so many other interests in play as compared to many years ago, we are never going to get it right the first time, if at all. But I think it also says something about the mindset that we have, right? The expectation that there will be a wave of or there might be a wave of a magic wand, and that we can accomplish lovability or deal with the questions of access and inclusivity via policy or administrative diktat. That's only, I think, in today's context, can only ever be a partial explanation for it. We do have to give space for messy emergence to take place. Many of these answers will come as a result of trial and error, as a result of negotiation, as a result of contestation, sometimes polite, sometimes not. But you know, that's part of growth, that's part of the evolution of society. And love is one of the things that grows and evolves.
Adrian, can I add to that? I think there's a question from in the Q&A about why are we even studying lovability when most Singaporeans say it's mostly lovable. And I think it adds to what you said, what Tong you said, and Don said, that we're starting the discourse. It is going to be messy, but just even asking the questions and even getting people to reflect on it and respond is part of what we need to do here, right? As designing a different world. As Tongi said, when you talk to this older folk, they might say, I don't even understand what you're talking about. But hopefully, it now is something that they might reflect or think about. Right? So I think we have to give ourselves some credit for just even starting the conversation.
No,
and by the way,
indeed,
this is a conversation not only locally, that we're starting the conversation globally. This is not something that is spoken about much. So I like that Singapore's leading in this.
No, indeed, right? Many of these things many of these words that we use them loosely. They mean different things to different people. But if we can't even come together to even talk about what exactly we mean by these terms, then we're nowhere. And this is a good start. And it may be that we will have perpetual beginnings and more beginnings and more beginnings, and this will never end. and that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah. And there's another question related to this saying, who do you want to participate in this study and why in terms of designing it? And I would say it's people not like us. We need to hear from, because we already have our opinions, we already have our input into the study. We need to hear from those who are not like us and get their voice into this as well. But Janine, you should probably opine on that.
Actually, before I opine on that, I actually think this is a really good opportunity to shift our conversation towards actually the second topic, which is, it's just coming up more and more, which is how we can actually design for a sense of ownership and agency. And that is exactly what we have been talking about all night. Actually, the whole movement towards designing that post-pandemic lovable Singapore, that endeavor to bring together diverse voices and redesign spaces and behavior and experiences that make Singapore more lovable. Actually, that won't come about until people actually feel that their efforts and their voices and their inputs will be heard, or they feel empowered to co-create or take some kind of action in the first place. And on that note, actually, there's a really interesting question in the Q&A, which is about shifting narratives. And that can be a pretty interesting place to start this conversation. So how can we shift the Singapore narrative from like fear and scarcity, which came up, in relationships to public institutions, towards satisfaction, and maybe beyond satisfaction, right? Maybe also empowerment. Yeah. Does anyone want to take up this rather complex question?
Okay, why don't I bite? No, as I looked at some of the survey results that you just did a few minutes ago, and you start to realize that they really aren't as binary as we think they are, right? Some of the unlovable traits that we see are the shadow side of the lovable traits. So a lovable trait is that Singapore is law-abiding and safe and all the things that we've come to associate with Singapore, and that's fantastic. Feed it steroids, push it a little bit, it tips over into being judgy and the law-abiding stickler for rules person could be the one to rustle up the lynch mob and light the torches and hound people who have committed transgressions. So so it's not really an either-or thing. Many of the things that we find unlovable about Singapore are actually aspects of us which are actually quite lovable, but taken to an extreme. And maybe it's a function of time as well. The context shifts. Certainly not speaking about myself, but a person with an adorable trait or quality some years ago might find that that same trait today is much despised and found to be extremely irritating. Speaking hypothetically, of course. And so it could be for Singapore as well, right? The thing that was extremely adorable and attractive and much loved in the context becomes hated, despised, scorned at in a different context, and it's different for different groups, different people. And I think this is something that we do need to accommodate, and we will never ever accommodate it perfectly. There will always be jagged pieces, right? We're not a jigsaw puzzle that's going to fit perfectly. We are jagged pieces. Sometimes we fit nicely, and sometimes we just going to end up rubbing each other the wrong way.
Actually, on this note, right, I want to kind of go back a little bit to something that we talked about earlier with regards to empowerment and participation. And I think Dawn mentioned earlier that actually not everybody wants to be involved. Not everybody wants to necessarily feel this need to co-create and design this whatever this new lovable Singapore is. And I think there's some kind of connection to what Adrian just mentioned. So it's actually a very nuanced issue, right? This whole concept of co-creation and empowerment. And I was just wondering what your thoughts on this are.
Yeah, thanks, Janine. Let me have a go at this. You're right that based on our sense of the people living here in Singapore, there's a group of people who really want to be involved and want to be activated and take charge and be part of any process that you open up to them. And there are those that may not want to be involved, but they want to know that we're engaging each other, that there's ways to be involved if they wish to be. And then there's a group that I think, when we talk about fear and scarcity, it's a real thing, right? Because there are people who are just trying to make each day work and just trying to pull it together. And really being participative in a civic kind of sense is not a priority, and that's okay. Hearing Adrian speak brings to mind a body of work by a guy called Barry Johnson called Polarity Management. That's the idea that, the light and shadow, the two ends of a spectrum, the both and, not the either or. So I think where Singapore needs to go going forward is to bring the two ends of a spectrum together, people across a whole bunch of perspectives together, so that we hear from each other, so that we know that when we make a choice, this is what we gain and this is what we might lose, and who are the people that gain and who are the people that lose. And it's having those conversations to broker common space. And even if the common space is never found, at least someone who has a different point of view than you. I think that really is the way forward if Singapore is to get past fear and scarcity, to be able to see the whole.
I mean, as an outsider, can I point out that as a narrative, Singapore breeds fear and scarcity as a way of driving nationalism, at least that's an outside-in point of view. So I think this has to be a little bit more top-down if we actually want to evolve that.
I think there's precisely one question that has popped up in the Q&A about the role of the government in all of this, right? When we went out to do the surveys and the interviews about Lovable Singapore, we did get some kind of interesting responses where our respondents tell us, a public agency is running a so-called ground-up initiative to study lovability. Is that weird? Is that ironic? So there's this question in the Q&A about how will the post-pandemic recovery period change Singapore's trust in the government? What is at stake? I think we can probably expand that a little bit to talk about what is this new relationship between public institutions and people, and what's changing in terms of how people want to be engaged and how people want to be to be brought on board.
I think like any relationship, Singapore citizens' relationship with Singapore is evolving as well, right? As is Singapore, as a nation and as a government. So all these things are evolving at the same time. Not everyone wants the same things that they wanted before. Not everything it has to be what it was before. And that's why I think at least some portion of the population wants to see a shift in narrative. And others are happy with it as it is and saying it's, this is, for all things considered, this is good and this is worth it. Once again, it's outside in point of view. So I'd love to hear more from those who have been here longer and understand this better.
Maybe I'll have a go at this. Delisha, you're saying you're speaking from the point of point of view of outsider. I mean, yes, and you see a sliver of the society, and the reality is everybody's reality is very different. The person who's 85 years old and the person who's 25 years old is a very different perspective. The person who's retired 85 years old, unfortunately, this is a person who retires with very little in his bank, right? I mean, Oops. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. My battery went low. So there's a person who, I'm always aware that, the pioneer generation, probably when they retire, their salary, a lot of them are no more than $700 for a month, and whoever dials in this particular webinar, we are faced it. We are from the middle income group, right? And our salary, our monthly salary, is many folds the salary of the person who retired 20 years ago. And his reality today is very different from the reality of a 40-year-old person or 25-year-old person. So, from this narrative of changing from scarcity and fear or whatever to satisfaction, yes, it may be applicable for certain segment of the population, but for certain segment of population, I agree with Dawn, it's very, very different. And so, that's the destiny of a country like ours that has developed so fast over the last 50 years, that we have both ends of the spectrum, right? So we are at the same time I won't say a mature economy, but a developed economy, but with a very long tail. And how to make these different segments of the population love Singapore and love our city takes very different means. Well, I'll stop there. People, these different segments of society have very different, sees things differently and find things lovable and find different things lovable. For some, it takes very little. For others, everything may be taken for granted, right? Okay, I'll stop here.
We've only got a few more minutes left, but I want to do something very selfish and kind of ask the panelists to answer questions that have highlighted contradictions in our study, so that when we write our report, we will have all these answers ready. The first one is from Yvonne. What is your interpretation of people finding being law-abiding a lovable trait, and yet at the same time finding regulations and laws from institutions unlovable? Quite a difficult question. Does anybody want to take it up?
So I'll have a go, and I don't have a magic answer, but I think it speaks to the point about polarity I mentioned earlier, right? So the polarity here, I suppose, putting it roughly, it's this idea of freedom. Of course, that's a good, and we all want freedom, but it's also order, I suppose, on the other end, and we all can value that as well. And Singapore, of course, I guess some navigates this space in a particular way, and maybe we lean more towards the order side, maybe a little bit less on the freedom side. And so we're all finding that balance, and that balance will shift from issue to issue and from time to time. And I guess all societies have to find that balance. What I wanted to link to is this point about, Prof. Heng was talking about the different groups of people. And I had earlier talked about the need to bring different voices together so that we're not just staying within our own circles or a narrow point of view. And the idea that comes to mind is in I guess, social theory, there's this notion about bonding social capital and bridging social capital. So bonding is people that are like you and you get to know them better, deepen relationships, and that's bonding capital. It's a good thing, of course. And so for instance, in my case, it would be people of my age group, people of my gender, perhaps. But bridging social capital is where you work across the boundaries, right? And you're trying to get connections with people very different from yourself. And so I think for me, just where Singapore needs to go is building a lot more on that bridging social capital. And that's how we will unlock things like the freedom and the order and navigating that space in a way that brings people together rather than breaks people apart.
Can I just add on to what Don said? Because, in asking that question, it reminds me of how every time we say it's unfair, we really mean it's unfair to me. But when it's unfair in my favor, we never complain about it. So I think there's a little bit of an element going on as well. We love the laws until they impinge on us or stop us from doing what we really want to do. So I think there's certainly an element of that going on there.
Also, I'll just quickly jump in and just talk about the distinction between laws and norms. That I think lower on the hierarchy of needs, when talking about safety and security, a lot of the laws support our safety and security. But in the whole work towards, belonging and self-actualization, a lot of the norms actually work against us. Yeah, in that whole sense of holding a container diverse enough to hold all the differences within Singapore. So I think no one has any issue itself with the fact that actually we are a safe country. It's whether or not we actually have an inclusive country that I think people are pushing up against. It's the norms, it's not the laws. Yeah.
Thanks, Yi. Actually, there are so many really great questions in the Q&A box. Unfortunately, I've realized that with a bit of a shock actually that it's now 7:31 and we are actually officially 1 minute over time. I think all these are really fantastic questions, and if our panelists actually don't mind, we can compile them and maybe put together short answers to some of the questions that are coming up quite frequently. If that's okay with everyone, we can follow up in this way. Yeah. So actually, I would like to now kind of bring this slide back up, which talks about our workshop, co-creating a Lovable Singapore, and I think that obviously segues very nicely from all the conversation about what the next step is now. So after this Lovable Singapore study is done, what do we do with the data? Well, is it going to sit somewhere and not be looked at? I think that would be a nightmare for all of us who have labored through this for more than a year. So there are actually 3 dates on the screen right now, and we will be identifying areas of high unlovability, for want of a better phrase, and facilitating some brainstorming sessions around them. So if you are able to join us, you would be very, very welcome to. Just scan the QR code here. And I think on this note, I will thank our speakers for sharing their evening with us, sharing their insights candidly and openly. And I think the conversation has been very exciting, as I can see some comments on the chat as well. Also, thank you to the audience and everyone for being so patient, with the tech boo-boo just now. I've been informed that it was entirely my fault. I was the one who put the wrong code. So yes, actually it's me. I blame Mentimeter, but actually it's me, yeah. So yes, apologies again. I hope you can please feel free to vent in our event survey, which is the QR code on the left. Yeah, please feel free to talk about that. But also give us another chance. On the right you can see casting hope, right? So we are really hoping that you will come back for more National Design Centre events and activities. So scan the QR code on the right for that. And on that note, thank you so much for being with us this evening. We will reach out to everybody who signed up with a link to the recording that we put online, and also further down the road in a couple of months' time when the final report is ready, we will also reach out to share it with everybody, and quite possibly there'll be another similar event organized around it. So yes, on that note, thank you very much, and have a good evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you,
everyone.
That's law abiding.
Thank you all.
Bye.